There are men who walk through life deaf to the whispers of warning, blind to the treachery that circles them like wolves in winter, and it is these men, proud, stubborn, foolish men, who discover truth only when the dagger slides between their ribs and the world goes cold and dark. Duke Adrian Thornwell was such a man, and this is the story of how he died twice, once in body, once in pride, before he could finally, truly, live. Hello friend. If you're enjoying this intriguing and dramatic tale of betrayal and suspense, I'd be so grateful for a like and a subscribe. My mum said I can't reach 1,000 subscribers, let's prove her wrong and make it happen. It will also help me bring you more stories of love, longing, and history. And if you don't mind, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I read every comment and it always brings a smile to my face. Now let's get back to this amazing story. Chapter 1. Picture, if you will, the grand estate of Thornwell Manor, rising from the misty hills of the northern duchy like a crown of grey stone and ancient privilege. Its towers pierce the autumn sky, its gardens sprawl in geometric perfection, and within its walls, power and wealth flow like wine at a nobleman's feast. For 3 generations, the Thornwell family has ruled these lands with an iron fist wrapped in velvet, and Duke Adrian Thornwell, at 32 years of age, stands as the latest in this illustrious line, a man of sharp intellect, sharper tongue, and a heart that has calcified into something resembling stone. The people whisper his name with respect, yes, but also with a certain coldness, for the Duke is a distant figure, a marble statue of authority who performs his duties with mechanical precision but without warmth, without joy, without the spark of humanity that separates a ruler from a tyrant. But Adrian was not always thus. 3 years past, he had been different, younger, softer, capable of laughter that echoed through these very halls. 3 years past, he had been married to the Lady Elena Ashford, a woman of ethereal beauty and gentle spirit, whose presence had been like sunlight breaking through winter clouds. They had been happy as nobility could be when duty and love occasionally aligned, and when Elena had announced her pregnancy, Adrian had felt something he rarely experienced, hope. Hope for a son, an heir, a future that extended beyond himself. But hope, as any student of life knows, is a fragile thing, easily shattered by the cruel hand of fate. One morning in early spring, Elena had gone riding on her favorite mare, a spirited creature she had raised from a foal. The horse had startled at something, a rabbit, perhaps, or a shadow, and Elena had fallen. The fall itself might not have killed her, but she struck her head upon a stone, and both she and the child she carried were lost in a single, senseless moment. Adrian had not wept at her funeral. He had stood like granite, accepting condolences with a nod, and then he had locked himself in his study for 3 days. When he emerged, something essential had been excised from his soul. The portrait of Elena that hung in his study became a shrine, a reminder of what he had lost, and in his grief, he made a fatal error, he decided never to feel such pain again. He would marry again, yes, because duty demanded it, because the duchy required an heir, but this time it would be different. This time, there would be no love, no vulnerability, no risk of devastation. This time, marriage would be purely transactional, a business arrangement dressed in wedding silk. Enter Lady Celeste Ashford, Elena's distant cousin, 26 years of age, possessing a mind as sharp as any scholar's and a face that, while comely enough, could never compete with the ethereal memory of Elena in Adrian's heart. Celeste had not sought this marriage, indeed, she had been content in her father's modest estate, managing his accounts and reading philosophy by candlelight, but when the Duke of Thornwell requests your hand, one does not refuse. Not if one values one's family's position, one's future, one's very survival in the cutthroat world of noble society. And so, 18 months before our tale truly begins, Celeste Ashford became Celeste Thornwell, Duchess of the Northern Lands, in a ceremony that was technically magnificent and emotionally hollow. Adrian had spoken his vows with all the passion of a man reading a shipping manifest. The wedding night had been awkward, perfunctory, a duty performed rather than a pleasure shared. And from that day forward, Adrian had made his intentions brutally clear: she was to produce an heir, manage the household, and otherwise remain a decorative fixture in his life, seen when necessary, ignored when possible. Celeste's blood had turned to ice in her veins. Transfer of power. His Highness? They could only mean Prince Aldrich, the king's younger brother, a man known for his ambition and his resentment at being born second. If Adrian died without an heir, the king would need to appoint a new duke, and Prince Aldrich had been angling for such a position for years. But surely these men were not suggesting what it sounded like they were suggesting. Surely they were not plotting against the duke himself. Celeste had hurried away before they could discover her, her mind racing with terrible possibilities, and by the time she reached Adrian's study, she had convinced herself she must have misunderstood. But Adrian needed to know. He needed to hear what she had heard and make his own judgment. She had knocked on his study door, and Adrian had answered with his customary irritation at being disturbed. "Yes, what is it?" "My lord, I need to speak with you." "It's urgent." Adrian had barely looked up from his papers. "Can it wait until morning?" "No, my lord, I don't believe it can. I've just overheard something disturbing. Lord Bancroft and Sir Varen were speaking in the East Wing, and they mentioned succession, and His Highness, and you were eavesdropping on my steward and my captain." Adrian's voice had been sharp with disapproval. "I wasn't eavesdropping intentionally, but my lord, they were discussing what happens if you have no heir, and they mentioned a transfer of power." Adrian had set down his quill with exaggerated patience. "Celeste, Lord Bancroft has served my family for 20 years. Sir Varen has saved my life twice. They were likely discussing contingency plans, as any responsible advisors would. It's their duty to consider all possibilities. But my lord, the way they were speaking, in secret, at midnight. You misunderstood their conversation. That is all." Adrian had returned to his papers, the dismissal clear. "In future, perhaps focus your attention on your own duties rather than playing spy." The words had stung like a slap, but Celeste had not given up. Not yet. Because in the days that followed, she began to notice other things, small discrepancies in the household accounts, guards posted in unusual locations, servants who averted their eyes when she passed. Something was wrong in Thornwell Manor, something rotten beneath the polished surface, and if her husband would not listen, then she would gather proof he could not ignore. She became a ghost in her own home, moving silently through corridors, observing, listening, learning. She befriended a young maid named Anna, barely 16, who had loose lips and access to the servants' gossip. Through Anna, Celeste learned of midnight meetings in the old armory, of letters arriving with the prince's seal, of gold changing hands in quantities that seemed excessive for ordinary business. She taught herself to pick the lock on Bancroft's office, a skill no duchess should possess but which Celeste had learned from a book in her father's library years ago, and she spent 3 terrifying hours one afternoon searching through his papers while he attended to business in town. What she found turned her suspicions into certainty, coded correspondence referencing the succession crisis and removing the obstacle and ensuring the duchy passes to worthy hands. She copied everything with trembling fingers, hiding the evidence in a box beneath a loose floorboard in her chambers. For 3 months, Celeste worked in secret, compiling her evidence like a magistrate building a case. She created a detailed report, cross-referencing dates and payments, identifying patterns of suspicious behavior, building an argument so compelling that even Adrian would have to acknowledge it. She worked by candlelight in the early hours of morning, sacrificing sleep and health, driven by a desperate need to save a man who did not love her but whom she could not, in good conscience, allow to walk blindly into destruction. And when she finally had everything organized, when her case was as airtight as she could make it, she requested an audience with her husband, her heart pounding with hope that this time, he would listen. Adrian had received her in his study with visible annoyance. "Yes, Celeste, what is it now?" She had laid the papers on his desk, her hands steady despite her nervousness. "My lord, I have been investigating the concerns I brought to you 3 months ago. Please, I beg you to look at this evidence. Lord Bancroft has been embezzling funds from the duchy treasury. Sir Varen has been accepting payments from Prince Aldrich. There are letters here that explicitly discuss removing you from power once it becomes clear you will have no heir. This is not a misunderstanding. This is treason. Adrian had glanced at the papers for perhaps 5 seconds before pushing them away. You've been spying on my advisors? Rifling through their private correspondence? My lord, please, just read. I will not entertain this paranoid fantasy, Celeste. You have too much time on your hands and an overactive imagination. Perhaps if you were with child, you would have better things to occupy your mind than creating elaborate conspiracies about loyal men who have served this house faithfully. The cruelty of that last comment had stolen her breath, but she had pressed on. My lord, I am not imagining this. The evidence is right there. They are plotting to kill you. Enough. Adrian had stood, his face flushed with anger. I don't know what game you're playing, whether you're bored or seeking attention or trying to manufacture drama in your otherwise empty life, but I will not tolerate these accusations against men who have bled for this duchy. Elena never bothered me with such paranoid nonsense. And there it was, the comparison Celeste had been dreading, the proof that she would always be measured against a dead woman and found wanting. She had gathered her papers with shaking hands and left the study, tears streaming down her face, but her resolve unbroken. She would try once more. She had to. That final attempt came 1 week later, when Celeste burst into a council meeting of the duchy's senior advisors, Bancroft, Varon, the Lord Treasurer, the Minister of Trade, and Adrian himself. All eyes had turned to her as she entered unannounced, her face flushed, her hands clutching yet more papers. My lords, forgive the intrusion, but I have discovered information that cannot wait. There is a conspiracy involving Prince Aldrich to claim this duchy upon my husband's death. Lord Bancroft and Sir Varon are being paid to ensure the Duke remains without an heir and vulnerable to assassination. The evidence is here, financial records, coded letters, testimony from servants. The room had erupted. Adrian had risen to his feet, his face purple with rage. This is unconscionable. You interrupt a council meeting to level wild accusations based on fantasy and suspicion. You've embarrassed yourself and humiliated me in front of my advisors. My lord, please, if you would just look. I have looked. I've looked at your so-called evidence multiple times, and it proves nothing except your disturbed state of mind. Lord Bancroft, Sir Varon, I apologize for my wife's behavior. Bancroft had stood, his expression one of wounded dignity. Your Grace, perhaps the Duchess is unwell. These delusions of conspiracy, this obsessive behavior, my own wife suffered similar episodes after losing a child. Perhaps rest and seclusion would help. Adrian had seized on this lifeline gratefully. Yes. Yes, that must be it. Celeste, you are clearly not yourself. I'm ordering you confined to your chambers until you've recovered your senses. Guards, escort the Duchess back to her rooms and ensure she remains there for her own safety. Celeste had been led away like a prisoner, her protests falling on deaf ears, her evidence scattered across the council table where it would surely disappear before day's end. As the guards had closed and locked her chamber door, she had sunk to the floor and wept, not for her own humiliation, but for the terrible knowledge that Adrian was going to die and there was nothing more she could do to save him. She had been right, of course. That very night, as Adrian worked late in his study reviewing trade agreements by candlelight, Sir Varon had entered with a contingent of guards. Your Grace, there's been a disturbance in the East Wing. A potential intruder. We need you to come with us to identify whether anything has been stolen. Adrian, trusting as ever in those he believed loyal, had followed without question. Varon had led him through the manor's corridors to a secluded hallway far from the main living quarters, far from witnesses, far from anyone who might hear or help. And there, in that shadowed passage, the guards had drawn their weapons. Adrian had frozen, confusion spreading across his face. What is the meaning of this? I'm sorry, Your Grace, Varon had said, though his scarred face showed no remorse. But you've become an obstacle to progress. You've had 3 years to produce an heir, and you've failed. The duchy cannot remain in the hands of a man who cannot secure its future. Understanding had dawned then, terrible and complete. Celeste. She tried to warn me. Your wife was more perceptive than you gave her credit for. A pity she married such a fool. Adrian had fought, he was trained in swordplay, had studied combat as all nobles must, but he was one man against 5, and these were hardened soldiers who had been ordered to ensure he did not survive. Blades had flashed in the lamplight. Adrian had managed to disarm one guard, wound another, but sheer numbers overwhelmed him. A sword had pierced his side, another his shoulder. He had fallen to his knees, blood spreading across the stone floor in a dark pool. Varin had stood over him, his blade pointed at Adrian's throat. Any last words, Your Grace? Adrian had coughed, tasting copper. His vision was blurring, darkness creeping in from the edges. Tell Celeste, tell her she was right. Tell her I'm sorry. I'll tell her nothing. She'll be married to Prince Aldrich within the month. Varin's blade had descended, and Adrian Thornwell, Duke of the Northern Lands, proud scion of 3 generations of rulers, had died on the cold stone floor of his own manor, killed by the men he had trusted, unable to heed the warnings of the woman he had dismissed. His last thought, as the darkness swallowed him whole, was of Celeste's face in his study, tears streaming down her cheeks as she begged him to listen, and he wondered, in that final instant of consciousness, how he could have been so blind, so arrogant, so catastrophically, fatally wrong. The official story, announced the next morning with great solemnity, was that Duke Adrian had tragically fallen down the stairs during the night, struck his head, and died instantly. The servants were instructed to mourn appropriately. The nobles were notified with all due ceremony. And Prince Aldrich, who arrived within hours of the announcement, graciously agreed to oversee the funeral arrangements and temporarily manage the duchy until the question of succession could be properly addressed. Celeste, still confined to her chambers under guard, heard the news from a tight-lipped maid and knew with perfect certainty that her husband had been murdered exactly as she had warned, and that she was now alone, imprisoned in her own home, with her husband's killers in complete control. But death, as it turns out, is not always the end of the story. Sometimes, by grace or curse, by divine intervention or cosmic accident, a soul is given another chance, another body, another opportunity to correct the mistakes of the past. And on the same night that Duke Adrian Thornwell breathed his last in a shadowed corridor, a young soldier named Kieran Moss fell during training exercises, struck his head upon the parade ground, and never woke up. His body was carried to the barracks and left on a cot while the medics debated whether to summon a physician or simply prepare him for burial. And into that empty vessel, into that vacant flesh, something extraordinary occurred. A consciousness that should have dissipated into the void instead found new purchase, new life, new form. When Adrian opened his eyes again, he saw a ceiling he did not recognize, felt a body that was not his own, and screamed into the uncaring night, not from pain, but from the terrible realization that death had not freed him from his failures, only transformed them into something stranger and more complicated than he could have possibly imagined. So I ask you now, dear listener, as Act 1 draws to its close and Adrian Thornwell finds himself impossibly, inexplicably alive in the body of a common soldier, what would you do if you died and woke in another's skin? If you had ignored every warning, dismissed every plea, and paid the ultimate price for your arrogance, only to be given a second chance in a form that no one would believe, no one would trust, no one would recognize? Would you have the courage to fight back, to reclaim what you lost, to admit you were wrong and beg forgiveness from the one person who tried to save you? Or would you accept that some mistakes are too grave for redemption, that some doors, once closed, can never be opened again? Chapter 2. To die is one kind of horror, but to wake from death in flesh that is not your own, to look down at hands that have never held a quill or worn a signet ring, to see in the mirror a face that is younger, rougher, entirely alien, that, dear listener, is a special variety of madness reserved for those whom fate has marked for either damnation or extraordinary redemption. Adrian Thornwell discovered this truth in the most violent way possible, gasping awake in darkness with the taste of dirt and blood in a mouth that was not the mouth he remembered, his heart, no, Kieran's heart, pounding with a rhythm that felt simultaneously familiar and impossibly wrong. The room was small, suffocating in its meanness. No tapestries adorned these walls, no Persian carpets softened these floors. This was the barracks of common soldiers, a place Adrian had visited in his capacity as duke but never truly seen, never understood in its grim functionality. Rough wooden bunks lined the walls, straw mattresses thin as parchment, the air thick with the smell of unwashed bodies and cheap tallow candles. Adrian, for though he inhabited Kieran Moss's flesh, his consciousness remained defiantly, terrifyingly his own, sat up with such violent haste that his head spun, and he pressed these foreign hands to his face, feeling the stubble there, the broader jaw, the nose that had been broken at least once and healed crooked. His breathing came in ragged gasps as panic clawed at his chest like a living thing. This could not be real. This could not be happening. Death was supposed to be an ending, a darkness from which one did not return, and yet here he was, impossibly, inexplicably, catastrophically alive. He stumbled to the small, cracked mirror that hung on the wall, a luxury even in these Spartan quarters, and what he saw reflected there made his stomach lurch with vertigo. The man staring back at him was perhaps 25 years of age, with sandy brown hair where Adrian's had been dark, with green eyes where Adrian's had been grey, with a face that was handsome in a rough, working-class way but bore none of the aristocratic refinement Adrian had possessed. This was Kieran Moss, a low-ranking soldier in the Duke's own guard, a man whose life had been as different from Adrian's as a candle is different from the sun. And yet, impossibly, Adrian remembered things, fragments of Kieran's life bleeding through like watercolors running together on wet paper. He remembered the feel of a sword in these hands, remembered drills in the parade ground, remembered a mother who had died of fever when he was 12, a father lost to war when he was 15. He remembered yesterday, no, 3 days ago now, climbing the practice tower, missing a handhold, falling, the crack of skull against stone, and then nothing. Kieran Moss had died, and somehow, in that moment between death and whatever comes after, Adrian Thornwell's soul had been thrust into this empty vessel like a hermit crab claiming an abandoned shell. The realization that followed was even worse than the initial shock. If Adrian was here, alive in Kieran's body, then what had happened in the world he had left behind? How long had he been unconscious? What had become of Celeste, of his duchy, of the conspiracy he had been too blind and too proud to stop? Adrian threw on the plain wool tunic and breeches that were Kieran's uniform, his fingers fumbling with lacings that felt both familiar and foreign, muscle memory from this new body guiding movements his mind had never learned. He had to get information, had to understand what had transpired in his absence, had to find some way to make sense of this impossible situation. But as he stepped out of the barracks into the grey morning light, he realized with cold certainty that no one in this world would believe the truth. To them, he was Kieran Moss, a common soldier who had suffered a head injury and was lucky to be alive at all. The Duke? The Duke was dead, and the funeral arrangements were already well underway. Adrian moved through the grounds of Thornwell Manor like a ghost haunting his own estate, and everywhere he turned, he heard the whispers. The servants spoke in hushed, frightened tones about the Duke's tragic accident, about how he had fallen in the night, about how Sir Varon himself had discovered the body and raised the alarm. The soldiers, Kieran's fellow guards, clapped him on the shoulder and expressed relief that he had recovered from his own fall, unaware that the consciousness behind Kieran's eyes was listening not with a soldier's casual interest but with a duke's desperate need to understand. Adrian learned that it had been 3 days since his death, 3 days since Varon's blade had ended his first life, and that Prince Aldrich had arrived with unseemly haste, bringing with him advisors and lawyers and an air of barely concealed triumph. The official funeral was scheduled for that very afternoon, a grand ceremony befitting a duke, and already the manor was draped in black crape, the servants moving about their duties with the mechanical efficiency of those who have performed these rituals many times before. But it was the news about Celeste that turned Adrian's borrowed blood to ice. She remained confined to her chambers under what Bancroft graciously termed protective custody, ostensibly for her own safety during this time of grief and transition, but Adrian knew the truth. She was a prisoner in her own home, kept isolated so she could not speak of what she knew, could not voice the accusations that Adrian had so foolishly dismissed. And worse, far worse, Adrian overheard two chambermaids discussing how Prince Aldrich had already indicated his intention to offer the Duchess his protection and support in her time of need, how rumors suggested a marriage alliance might be arranged to stabilize the duchy's future. The thought of Celeste forced to marry his murderer, forced to legitimize Aldrich's claim through her own body and title, filled Adrian with a rage so profound that Kieran's hands clenched into fists and several soldiers gave him odd looks as he stood trembling in the courtyard. It was in this moment of fury and helplessness that Adrian made his first catastrophic mistake. He approached a group of senior guards, men he had known, in his previous life, as loyal soldiers, and in his desperation, he spoke without thinking. "Listen to me, all of you. I know this sounds impossible, but you must believe me. I am Duke Adrian Thornwell. I died 3 nights ago, murdered by Sir Varon and the others, and I have somehow returned in this body. You know me, ask me anything, any detail about the duchy, about our campaigns, about your own service records. I can prove it." The reaction was not what he had hoped. The soldiers stared at him with expressions ranging from pity to alarm, and the eldest among them, a grizzled veteran named Marcus, laid a hand on Adrian's shoulder with the gentleness one might use with a disturbed child. "Kieran, lad, you took a bad fall. Hit your head something fierce. Sometimes that can make a man's thoughts go a bit sideways. You should rest, not be talking nonsense about being the Duke, God rest his soul. I'm not mad. Test me. Ask me something only the Duke would know." But Marcus was already steering him away from the others, his voice dropping to a warning whisper. "Listen to me, boy. I don't know what's gotten into your head, but if you keep spouting this madness, they'll have you in chains or worse. Men have been hanged for less than impersonating nobility. Whatever you think you remember, whatever dreams that knock on the head gave you, keep them to yourself unless you fancy a noose." Adrian had nearly persisted, nearly pressed the point until they had no choice but to arrest him or at least forcibly remove him from the grounds, but some last vestige of sanity held him back. Marcus was right, no one would believe a low-born soldier claiming to be a dead duke. They would think him mad, or worse, think him part of some elaborate plot to destabilize the succession. If he pushed too hard, he would find himself locked away or dead, and then he would be no use to anyone, least of all Celeste. No, he needed a different approach. He needed proof that could not be denied, evidence that would force even the most skeptical to consider the impossible. And most urgently, he needed to reach Celeste, because she was the only person in this entire duchy who might, just might, be willing to believe him. The funeral took place that afternoon with all the pomp and ceremony befitting a duke's passing, and Adrian watched from the back of the crowd, hidden among the common soldiers who had been ordered to attend and pay their respects. He saw his own body, his real body, laid out in the grand coffin, dressed in ceremonial armor, the face composed in an expression of peace that Adrian knew he had not worn in his final moments. He saw Prince Aldrich standing at the head of the coffin, looking appropriately solemn while his eyes gleamed with barely suppressed satisfaction. He saw Bancroft and Varon, both playing their parts as grieving, loyal servants, their faces masks of sorrow that made Adrian want to scream the truth to the assembled nobles. And he saw Celeste, brought down from her chambers for the ceremony, dressed in widow's blacks that made her pale skin seem translucent, her eyes red from weeping, her hands trembling as she laid a white rose on Adrian's coffin. In that moment, seeing her grief, genuine grief for a man who had treated her with coldness and contempt, Adrian felt something crack open in his chest, some wall he had built after Elena's death finally crumbling under the weight of his guilt and regret. She had loved him. Perhaps not with the passionate, all-consuming love of poetry and romance, but she had cared for him, had tried to save him, had wept for him when he died. And he had repaid her concern with dismissal, her warnings with mockery, her devotion with comparison to a ghost. Standing there in Kieran's body, anonymous among the crowd, Adrian swore an oath more binding than any wedding vow, he would make this right. He would expose the conspiracy, reclaim his position, and he would earn Celeste's forgiveness if it took him the rest of this borrowed life to do so. But first, he had to reach her, and that was proving more difficult than anticipated. After the funeral, Celeste was escorted back to her chambers by guards Adrian recognized as Varen's personal men, loyal not to the duchy but to the conspiracy. The manor was locked down tight, with sentries at every entrance, and Adrian could not simply walk through the front door demanding to see the Duchess without raising immediate suspicion. He spent the evening pacing his barracks quarters, Kieran's memories providing him with knowledge of guard rotations and patrol patterns, while Adrian's own memories gave him something far more valuable, knowledge of the secret passages built into Thornwell Manor's walls, passages that his grandfather had commissioned for quick escapes during times of siege, passages that only the Duke and his most trusted advisors knew existed. Kieran would never have known about these hidden corridors, but Adrian did, and therein lay his advantage. Near midnight, when the manor had settled into uneasy sleep, Adrian slipped from the barracks and made his way to the east wing, moving with the confident stride of a guard on legitimate patrol. He nodded to the sentries he passed, and they nodded back, seeing only Kieran Moss going about his duties. When he reached the portrait gallery, that long hall lined with paintings of Thornwell ancestors stretching back generations, Adrian paused before a portrait of his great-grandmother, a stern woman in Tudor dress whose painted eyes seemed to follow visitors with judging intensity. Adrian pressed the lower right corner of the frame, felt the mechanism click, and watched as the portrait swung outward on hidden hinges to reveal a dark passageway beyond. He glanced over his shoulder to ensure no one had seen, then slipped inside, pulling the portrait closed behind him and plunging himself into absolute darkness. The passages were narrow, dusty, untouched for perhaps decades, and Adrian navigated them from memory, his hands trailing along rough stone walls, his feet finding their way by instinct developed over a lifetime of secret explorations as a child and occasional use as an adult. He climbed hidden staircases, traversed corridors that ran between the manor's visible walls, and eventually emerged in a servant's passage that opened near the family quarters. From there, it was a simple matter to locate Celeste's chambers. Guards were posted outside her door, but the passages ran behind the walls, and Adrian knew there was a concealed door that opened into her dressing room, a door designed to allow discreet escapes in case of attack. His fingers found the catch, pressed, and the panel swung inward with barely a whisper of sound. Celeste's chambers were dimly lit by a single candle burning on her bedside table, and she sat at her window, still dressed in her funeral blacks, staring out at the night with eyes that looked far older than her 26 years. She did not hear him enter, so lost was she in her grief and rage and helplessness, and Adrian stood frozen for a moment, drinking in the sight of her, this woman he had so thoroughly failed to appreciate. When he finally spoke, his voice soft to avoid startling her, she whirled around with a gasp, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle a scream. "Forgive me, Your Grace," Adrian said quickly, using Kieran's voice to speak words that felt strange on this unfamiliar tongue. "I mean you no harm. I've come because I have something impossible to tell you, and I pray you'll have the patience to hear me out before you call for the guards." Celeste backed away from him, her eyes wide with fear and confusion. "Who are you? How did you get in here?" "The guards will not hear us if we keep our voices down. My name is Kieran Moss, or at least, this body belongs to Kieran Moss. But the consciousness inhabiting it, the soul if you will, is someone you know. Someone you tried very hard to save." Adrian took a breath, knowing how insane this would sound, knowing he was about to gamble everything on whether this woman he had wronged so deeply would be willing to believe the impossible. "Lady Celeste, I know this sounds like madness, but I am Adrian. I am your husband. I was murdered 3 nights ago by Varen and his men, just as you warned me, and I woke up in this soldier's body. I am Duke Adrian Thornwell, and I have come back to make things right." The look on Celeste's face was one of utter horror, and she shook her head violently, tears springing to her eyes. "No. No, this is cruel. This is monstrous. Who sent you? Was it Bancroft? Aldrich? Did they send you here to torment me with this grotesque impersonation?" "No one sent me. Celeste, please, I know how this sounds. You cannot be him. Adrian is dead. I saw his body. I laid roses on his coffin. Whatever game you're playing, whatever you hope to gain from this cruelty. Then test me, Adrian interrupted, desperation making his voice sharp. Ask me things only your husband would know. Ask me about our wedding night, about the way you tried so hard to make me love you and I pushed you away at every turn. Ask me about Elena, about how I kept her rooms like a shrine, about how I compared you to her and found you wanting even though you were 10 times the woman she was and I was too blind to see it. Celeste stared at him, her breath coming in short gasps, her mind clearly racing. Anyone could have learned those things. Servants gossip, guards talk. You have a scar on your left shoulder, shaped like a crescent moon, from when you fell from a tree as a child trying to retrieve a kitten. You told me about it on our wedding night when I asked, and I never mentioned it to anyone. You read philosophy, particularly the Stoics, and you keep a journal under your mattress where you write your true thoughts because you cannot speak them aloud. Your favorite color is not the pink you wear to please others, but deep green, the color of forests. You wanted children, not just for the duchy's sake, but because you grew up lonely as an only child and dreamed of a house full of laughter. And I, God forgive me, I knew all of this and dismissed it as unimportant because I was determined never to care about you the way I cared about Elena. The tears were flowing freely down Celeste's face now, and her voice came out as barely a whisper. How could you possibly know these things? Because I listened, even when I pretended not to. Because you told me these things over dinners I ignored, during conversations I cut short, in moments when you tried to reach me and I turned away. I heard you, Celeste. I just didn't care enough to act on what I heard. But I'm listening now. I'm finally listening. Celeste sank into a chair, her legs seeming to give out beneath her, and she stared at Adrian, at Kieran's face with Adrian's soul behind the eyes, with an expression that mingled terror and hope and desperate, dangerous possibility. This is impossible. The dead do not return. Souls do not jump from body to body like actors changing costumes. I know. I know it's impossible. I died thinking it was the end, and I woke up in this body with no explanation, no understanding of how or why. But I am Adrian Thornwell, and I have been given a second chance I do not deserve, and I will use it to do what I should have done when I was alive. I will listen to you, believe you, and together we will expose these traitors and take back what they have stolen. There was a long silence, broken only by the sound of Celeste's ragged breathing and the distant chiming of the manor's clock tower marking the hour past midnight. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady, controlled, the voice of a woman who had survived months of dismissal and imprisonment and had not yet broken. Tell me how you died. Tell me exactly what happened that night, details that only the Duke would know. And so Adrian told her, recounting Varen's trap, the fight in the corridor, the blade that had pierced his side, the final words about Celeste being married to Aldrich. He told her about waking in Kieran's body, about the confusion and terror, about overhearing the plans to force her into marriage to legitimize the prince's claim. He told her everything, holding nothing back, and as he spoke, he watched Celeste's expression shift from skepticism to wonder to a grim, terrible acceptance. When he finished, Celeste stood and walked to him, stopping close enough that Adrian could see the flecks of gold in her brown eyes, close enough that Kieran's heart, no, his heart now, began to beat faster. She reached up and touched his face, this face that was not Adrian's but somehow contained him nonetheless, and her touch was gentle, searching, as if she could feel through the flesh to the soul beneath. If you are truly Adrian, she whispered, then you know you owe me an apology that no words could ever adequately express. You know that you failed me in every way a husband can fail a wife. You know that you are at least partially responsible for your own death because you refused to believe what I risked everything to tell you. I know, Adrian said, and his voice cracked with emotion that Kieran's body had never felt but Adrian's soul carried like a wound. I know, and I am so sorry. I was a fool, Celeste. I was arrogant and blind and cruel, and you deserved so much better than what I gave you. I cannot undo the past. I cannot take back the words I said or the coldness I showed you. But I can fight for you now. I can believe you now. I can be the man you needed me to be then, even if it's too late, even if you can never forgive me." Celeste's hand dropped from his face, and she turned away, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. When she finally turned back, her face was composed again, that mask of noble dignity she wore so well, but her eyes blazed with something fierce and unbreakable. "If we do this, if we work together to expose these traitors and reclaim your position, you must understand something. I am not doing this because I love you, Adrian. I do not know if I can ever love the man who treated me as you did. I am doing this because it is right, because Bancroft and Varon and Aldrich are murderers and traitors who deserve justice. Do you understand?" Adrian nodded, accepting this boundary, this wall she needed to keep between them. "I understand. And I promise you this, whether you ever forgive me or not, whether we remain married only in name or find some way forward together, I will spend whatever time I have in this body proving that you were right about everything. You were the wise one, the perceptive one, the one who saw the truth while I was blinded by pride. I will make certain the world knows that." And so, in the darkness of her chambers, with guards outside her door and traitors sleeping in beds they had stolen through murder, Celeste Thornwell and the man who was both her husband and a stranger made their plans. They would need proof, evidence that could not be denied. They would need allies from among the guards and servants who had remained loyal. They would need to retrieve the secret codicil Adrian had written, a document that would block Aldrich's claim by naming Celeste as heir. Most of all, they would need to find a way for Adrian to prove his identity in a manner that would convince not just Celeste, but the nobles, the soldiers, perhaps even the king himself. It was an impossible task, a desperate gambit with odds stacked impossibly against them. But as dawn began to lighten the eastern sky and Adrian prepared to slip back through the hidden passages before the servants began their morning rounds, Celeste caught his hand, this hand that was Kieran's but moved with Adrian's intent, and squeezed it once, hard, a gesture of tentative alliance if not yet trust. "If you truly are my husband returned from death," she said, her voice low and fierce, "then prove it not with words, but with action. Be the man you should have been. Listen when I speak. Trust my judgment. Fight not just for your title, but for what is right. Do these things, and perhaps, I will believe that this impossible second chance was meant for something more than mere vengeance." Adrian brought her hand to his lips, a gesture that felt both foreign in this body and achingly familiar in his soul, and made a vow more sacred than any he had spoken before his death. "I will earn your trust, Celeste. Even if it takes the rest of this borrowed life, I will earn it." And with that promise hanging in the air between them like a covenant written in starlight and desperation, Act 2 of our tale drew to its close, leaving our protagonist standing on the precipice of a battle that would determine not just the fate of a duchy, but the question of whether love can be born from ashes, whether redemption can be earned through suffering, and whether a man given a miraculous second chance can finally become the person he should have been all along. Chapter 3. But how does one reclaim a life that has already been buried, a title that has already been stripped away, a position that powerful men have schemed for years to steal? This was the question that burned in Adrian's mind as he and Celeste began the dangerous work of gathering allies in a manor filled with enemies, and the answer, as it turned out, would require not just courage and cunning, but a willingness to risk everything on a single, audacious gamble that would either restore what had been lost or destroy them both utterly. The days following their midnight alliance moved with the terrible speed of an avalanche gaining momentum, and Adrian discovered that inhabiting Kieran's body gave him an advantage he had never anticipated: invisibility. As Duke, he had been watched constantly, his every movement noted, his every conversation potentially significant. But as Kieran Moss, common soldier, he could move through the manor's corridors unremarked, could listen to conversations that men of power never imagined a low-born guard would understand or care about. He used this freedom ruthlessly, eavesdropping on Bancroft's meetings with Prince Aldrich, observing Varon's deployment of guards to ensure certain areas remained inaccessible, mapping the conspiracy's extent with the methodical precision of a military strategist. What he discovered chilled him to the bone. The plot ran deeper than even Celeste had suspected, with tendrils reaching into the king's own court, merchants who had been bribed to falsify records, nobles who had been promised favors in exchange for their support of Aldrich's claim. Meanwhile, Celeste worked from within her gilded cage, using the limited freedom granted to a grieving widow to send carefully coded messages to servants she still trusted, retrieving the evidence she had compiled months ago from its hiding place beneath her floorboards, and most crucially, maintaining the pretense of a woman broken by grief and willing to consider Prince Aldrich's suit for her hand. She played her part magnificently, accepting Aldrich's condolences with downcast eyes, listening to his proposals for the duchy's future with apparent docility, all while cataloguing every word, every slip, every piece of information that might prove useful when the time came to strike. Adrian, watching her perform this delicate deception during his covert visits through the hidden passages, felt admiration bloom in his chest like spring flowers after winter. This woman whom he had dismissed as merely decorative possessed a spine of pure steel and a mind sharp enough to cut through any pretense. Together, they identified 3 soldiers who had served Adrian with genuine loyalty, men who had seemed troubled by the Duke's sudden death, who had questioned the official story in whispers, who might be willing to risk everything if presented with sufficient proof. Adrian approached them individually, using Kieran's familiarity to request private conversations, and then revealed himself in the same way he had to Celeste, offering information only the Duke could possess, answering questions about campaigns and decisions that no common soldier could know. The first man, Marcus, the grizzled veteran who had warned Adrian to stop his mad claims, stared at him for a long moment before slowly, carefully kneeling. The second, a younger soldier named Thomas, wept openly, swearing vengeance on those who had murdered his duke. The third, a taciturn archer called Willem, simply nodded and said, "I knew something was rotten. Tell me what needs doing." With these 3 as his core, Adrian began building a network of loyal men, never more than could be trusted absolutely, never so many that word might leak to Varen's spies. But soldiers alone would not be enough to reclaim a duchy, and Adrian knew that the key to his restoration lay in a document he had drafted 18 months earlier, shortly after marrying Celeste, a secret codicil to his will that he had hidden in a compartment behind a false panel in his study, a compartment whose location only he knew. The codicil was insurance against exactly this sort of succession crisis, stating explicitly that should Duke Adrian die without legitimate children, the duchy would pass not to the king's appointment but directly to his wife, Celeste Thornwell, with full authority to rule in her own right. Such a provision was unusual but not unprecedented. His own grandmother had ruled the duchy for 15 years after his grandfather's death, and it would, if presented to the king, completely block Prince Aldrich's claim and expose the murder for what it was, an illegal seizure of power. The problem, of course, was that the study was now Aldrich's temporary headquarters, guarded day and night, and breaking in to retrieve the document would require perfect timing and more than a little luck. The opportunity came during a state dinner that Prince Aldrich hosted to court the duchy's most powerful nobles, a lavish affair designed to demonstrate that the transition of power would be smooth, profitable, and advantageous to all who supported it. While the great hall filled with nobles drinking Aldrich's wine and eating Aldrich's food, Adrian led his small team through the hidden passages to a point that opened near the Duke's study. They wore dark clothes, moved in absolute silence, and carried weapons concealed beneath their cloaks. If discovered, they would fight their way out or die trying, for there would be no second chance at this. Adrian's heart, that borrowed heart that beat in Kieran's chest, hammered with such violence that he feared it might give them away, but he forced himself to breathe slowly, to move carefully, to be the leader these men needed him to be. The study was not empty when they arrived. Bancroft was there, as Adrian had hoped he might be, bent over the Duke's desk sorting through papers with the meticulous care of a man destroying evidence. Adrian stepped from the shadows and spoke softly, his voice carrying the authority of a duke despite the common soldier's body from which it emerged. "Lord Bancroft. I believe you're looking for something that belongs to me." Bancroft spun around, his hand flying to the dagger at his belt, his face draining of color as he recognized not Kieran the soldier but something in the eyes, the bearing, the tone that was unmistakably Adrian Thornwell. "Impossible," he whispered, backing against the desk. "You're dead. I saw them kill you." "You saw them kill my body," Adrian corrected, moving closer while his men fanned out to block the exits. But I am still here, Bancroft, returned from death to see justice done for your betrayal. You served my family for 20 years, and you sold us to that ambitious princeling for what? Gold? Promises of position? Was it worth it? Bancroft's shock gave way to calculation, his mind visibly working through the implications, the possibilities, the potential for salvaging the situation. No one will believe you. You're a common soldier making mad claims. Then let us test that theory. Let us bring you before the assembled nobles and see whether they believe a loyal steward or a dead duke who knows every secret of this house. Adrian gestured to the wall behind the desk. There's a hidden compartment 3 feet from the floor, behind the third panel from the left. Inside it, you'll find a codicil to my will naming Celeste as my heir. You were looking for it, weren't you? Aldrich ordered you to destroy any document that might complicate his claim. But you haven't found it because you don't know this house the way I do. Shall I prove it? The color had returned to Bancroft's face, but now it was the flush of a cornered animal, and his hand tightened on his dagger. If you're the Duke, then you'll die twice, and this time there will be no miraculous resurrection. He lunged forward with surprising speed for a man of his years, the blade aimed at Adrian's throat, but Adrian had been trained in combat since childhood, and though Kieran's body was less refined than his original form, it was younger, faster, stronger. He sidestepped the attack, caught Bancroft's wrist, and twisted until the dagger clattered to the floor. Marcus and Thomas seized the steward before he could recover, forcing him to his knees while Willem kept watch at the door. Adrian retrieved the codicil from its hiding place. The compartment opened exactly where he had said it would, responding to pressure applied in a specific sequence that only he knew, and held the document up to the lamplight, checking that the wax seal remained intact, that the king's notary's signature was still legible. Everything was as he had left it, a piece of insurance that was about to become the weapon that would destroy his enemies. He looked down at Bancroft, who was struggling uselessly against the soldier's grip, and felt not satisfaction but a deep, bone-weary sadness. You could have come to me, told me of Aldrich's approach, remained loyal. I would have rewarded that loyalty, protected you. Instead, you chose treason, and now you will face the consequences. But Bancroft's capture was only the beginning, for the codicil alone would not be enough to reclaim the duchy. Adrian needed to prove publicly, before witnesses who could not be intimidated or bribed, that he was truly who he claimed to be. The opportunity for such proof would come the next day, when Prince Aldrich had scheduled a formal ceremony in the Grand Hall to announce his assumption of the duchy's governance pending the king's official approval. Every noble in the region would be present, along with the duchy's senior officials, military commanders, and prominent merchants. It would be the perfect stage for Adrian's revelation, provided he could survive long enough to make it. That night, as Adrian finalized their plans with Celeste in her chambers, she asked him the question that had been hanging between them since their alliance began. If we succeed, if you reclaim your position and I am acknowledged as Duchess with full rights under your codicil, what happens to us? To this marriage that was never truly a marriage? You speak of earning my trust, of proving yourself, but Adrian, even if I come to believe you've changed, how can we build a life together when you inhabit a stranger's body? When every time I look at you, I see not the man I married but a soldier I never knew. Adrian had no easy answer for this, no reassurance that could dissolve the strangeness of their situation. I don't know, he admitted, sitting beside her in the candlelight, close but not touching, aware of the vast distance that still yawned between them despite their alliance. I know that I wronged you terribly in my first life, that I was a poor husband and a worse friend. I know that you deserve better than a man who needed to die before he could appreciate your worth. But I also know that I am given this second chance for a reason, and whether we remain married in truth or only in name, whether you ever come to care for me or choose to seek happiness elsewhere once this crisis has passed, I will spend my days trying to be worthy of the faith you're placing in me now. That is all I can promise. Celeste studied his face, Kieran's face, with Adrian's soul looking out through those green eyes, and something softened in her expression, some wall that had been held rigid by hurt and anger beginning, perhaps, to crack. Then promise me one more thing. Promise that when this is over, when the duchy is secure and justice has been served, you will allow me to make my own choice about our future. That you will not claim husbandly rights or demand my affection as payment for reclaiming your position. Let me choose freely whether to stay or go, to love or simply respect. Can you promise that? I promise, Adrian said without hesitation, and he meant it with every fiber of this borrowed being. Your freedom to choose will be absolute. I would rather have your respect earned freely than your love coerced by duty. The ceremony began at noon the following day with all the pageantry that Prince Aldrich could muster, the grand hall bedecked with banners bearing both the Thornwell crest and the royal arms, as if to suggest that this transfer of power had the king's blessing when in truth the king had only given provisional approval pending investigation of the succession crisis. Aldrich stood at the front of the hall in robes that bordered on ducal in their magnificence. Bancroft's absence explained away as sudden illness, Celeste seated in a position of honor that emphasized her supposed cooperation with the new regime. The nobles filed in with expressions ranging from genuine support to barely concealed skepticism, for not all were pleased to see an ambitious prince claiming a duchy through such questionable circumstances. Into this assembly, Adrian walked with his 3 loyal soldiers flanking him, their hands on their weapons, their faces grim with purpose. The hall fell silent as Adrian strode down the central aisle, every eye turning to this common soldier who moved with such authority, such confidence, such unmistakable command. Prince Aldrich, standing at the dais, raised an imperious hand. What is the meaning of this interruption? Guards, remove this man. I am Duke Adrian Thornwell, Adrian announced, his voice carrying to every corner of the hall with the projection he had learned in military command, and I have returned to expose the conspiracy that murdered me and sought to steal my duchy through treachery and lies. The hall erupted in shocked exclamations, but Adrian pressed forward, climbing the steps to the dais to stand level with Aldrich, close enough to see the prince's face cycle through surprise, fury, and calculation. I know this seems impossible, that the dead do not return, but I stand before you now, and I challenge Prince Aldrich and his co-conspirators to dispute the knowledge I possess, the secrets I can reveal, the proof I can provide that I am who I claim to be. What followed was perhaps the strangest trial in the duchy's history, as Adrian submitted to questioning from the assembled nobles, answering queries about trade agreements, family histories, military campaigns, financial arrangements, and 100 other details that only Duke Adrian Thornwell could possibly know. He revealed the location of hidden ledgers that proved Bancroft's embezzlement. He recited private conversations he had held with specific nobles, conversations that had taken place in sealed rooms with no witnesses. He described the interior of the duchy's vault, which only the Duke and the Lord Treasurer were permitted to enter, down to the number of gold bars stored in the 3rd chamber and the specific arrangement of family jewels in their cases. With each answer, the murmurs of skepticism grew quieter, the looks of wonder more pronounced. But Prince Aldrich, desperate now, played his final card. Even if this soldier somehow possesses the Duke's knowledge, through sorcery or spycraft or some other means, he cannot be the Duke-in-law. Duke Adrian Thornwell's body lies in the family crypt. This is merely an impostor, a man possessed or coached, and I demand that he be arrested for this blasphemous impersonation. It was Celeste who rose then, her voice clear and strong as she addressed the assembly. My lords, I have spoken extensively with this man, and I believe he is my husband returned. But the law is the law, and Prince Aldrich is correct that extraordinary claims require extraordinary proof. Therefore, I invoke the ancient right of trial, which allows any person to claim a noble title if they can demonstrate through trial of knowledge, combat, and judgment that they possess the qualities necessary to rule. Let this man prove himself not through identity alone, but through worthiness to hold the position he claims. The king's representative, who had been present to oversee the succession proceedings, considered this gravely and then nodded. The right of trial is indeed ancient law, rarely invoked but still valid. I will permit these trials, and their outcome will determine whether this man's claim has merit. And so Adrian faced 3 tests before the assembled nobles. First, a detailed examination of duchy governance and history, which he passed by demonstrating knowledge that exceeded even the scholar's expectations. Second, a combat trial against 3 of Aldrich's best soldiers, which Adrian won through a combination of his own training and Kieran's younger, more powerful body, his swordwork elegant despite the unfamiliar flesh. And third, a judgment trial where he resolved a complex dispute between two noble families over water rights and inheritance, displaying the wisdom and fairness that had marked his best decisions as duke. When the trials concluded, the king's representative stood and pronounced judgment. By law and by demonstration, I recognize this man as possessing both the knowledge and the qualities of Duke Adrian Thornwell. Whatever supernatural means have brought this about, and I confess I do not understand them, I am satisfied that the consciousness, the soul if you will, that governs this body is indeed that of the rightful duke. Therefore, I restore to him his title, his lands, and his authority. The arrests that followed were swift and merciless. Prince Aldrich was seized by royal guards and charged with conspiracy to commit murder and attempted usurpation. Varon, who had tried to flee when Adrian's identity was confirmed, was captured in the stables and dragged back to face justice. Bancroft, confronted with the evidence Adrian had compiled, confessed in exchange for a quicker death than hanging. The trials were brief, the verdicts unanimous, and within a week, the conspirators had been punished according to the severity of their crimes, Aldrich stripped of titles and exiled to a remote monastery, Varon and Bancroft executed for treason and murder. The duchy, secured at last, began the slow process of healing from the wound that had been inflicted upon it. But for Adrian and Celeste, the real work was only beginning, the work of learning to trust one another, of building something real from the ashes of their failed first attempt at marriage. Adrian proved himself day by day, consulting Celeste on every major decision, implementing reforms that reflected both his ducal experience and Kieran's understanding of how common people lived, governing with a wisdom tempered by death and rebirth. And Celeste, watching this man who wore a stranger's face but spoke with her husband's knowledge in a humility her husband had never possessed, found herself drawn not to the duke he had been but to the man he was becoming. 6 months after the trials, she came to him in his study, no longer sleeping in separate chambers, but not yet sharing a bed, and placed her hand over his where it rested on the desk. "I have made my choice," she said quietly. "I choose to stay. Not because duty demands it, not because you are the duke and I the duchess, but because I see in you the man I hoped for when we first married. It has taken death and resurrection and more pain than either of us should have endured, but here we are, two people given an impossible second chance. Let us not waste it." Adrian looked up at his wife, this remarkable woman who had saved him twice, once by trying to prevent his death, once by helping him reclaim his life, and felt love bloom in his chest with an intensity that made his borrowed heart ache. "Then let us renew our vows," he said. "Not the cold ceremony we had before, but a true wedding, a genuine union. Let me marry you again, Celeste, and this time I will mean every word." The wedding took place on the first anniversary of Adrian's death and rebirth, a ceremony intimate and joyful, attended by those who had remained loyal and those who had helped expose the conspiracy. When Adrian and Celeste exchanged their vows, promises to listen, to trust, to cherish, to stand together against whatever trials the future might bring, there was not a dry eye in the chapel, for all present understood that they were witnessing not just a marriage but a miracle, not just a union but a redemption. And when Adrian kissed his wife, this woman he had failed so profoundly and who had given him the precious gift of a second chance, he knew with absolute certainty that some mistakes, no matter how grievous, can be transformed through suffering into something beautiful, that some loves, no matter how unlikely, can bloom even in the strangest soil. 1 year later, Celeste gave birth to a son, a healthy boy with his mother's eyes and a lusty cry that echoed through Thornwell Manor like a promise of continuity and hope. Adrian, holding his heir for the first time, marveled at the weight of him, the perfect tiny fingers, the absolute trust in that infant gaze. He had been given everything he thought he wanted in his first life, title, land, power, and had lost it all through his own blindness. Now, in this second life, in this borrowed body that had become truly his own, he held what actually mattered, a wife who was his true partner, a son who would grow up knowing his father's love, a duchy that prospered under governance built on justice rather than pride. He had died to learn how to live, and the lesson, though harsh, had been worth every moment of suffering. So I ask you now, dear listener, what would you do if given such a chance? If you had ignored the warnings of those who loved you, if you had lost everything through your own stubbornness, if you were granted a miraculous opportunity to make things right, would you have the courage to admit your failures, to humble yourself before those you had wronged, to build something new from the ruins of what you had destroyed? Would you recognize that sometimes the greatest strength lies not in being right but in acknowledging when you were wrong? And if someone you loved came back to you changed, humbled, desperate to earn your forgiveness, would you have the grace to give them that second chance, or would you let past hurts poison any possibility of future joy? These are the questions that linger long after our tale has ended, questions without easy answers but worth pondering nonetheless. For we all, in our way, are given second chances, perhaps not as dramatic as Adrian's, perhaps not involving death and resurrection, but chances nonetheless to correct our course, to listen better, to love more fully, to become the people we should have been all along. Now I want to hear from you. Tell me in the comments below, do you believe Adrian truly earned Celeste's forgiveness, or did she forgive him too easily? Would you have been able to trust someone who had treated you as Adrian treated her, even if they showed genuine remorse and change? And most importantly, what warning signs in your own life have you ignored that you wish you had heeded sooner? Share your thoughts, your stories, your own experiences with second chances and lessons learned the hard way. Your perspective matters, your voice adds to this conversation, and I read every single comment because, like Celeste tried to teach Adrian, listening to others is how we grow, how we learn, how we avoid the tragic mistakes that come from thinking we alone possess all wisdom. Hit that subscribe button if you want more stories like this, tales of redemption, romance, and the enduring power of second chances. And remember, the warnings we ignore today may become the regrets we carry tomorrow, so listen carefully to those who care enough to tell you hard truths. Until next time, may you have the wisdom to hear what needs hearing, the courage to change what needs changing, and the grace to forgive both yourself and others when we all, inevitably, fall short of who we hope to be.